All right, welcome to the 635 podcast, and I am back here with Kevin Jefferies.
Hello.
It's been a long time. I think it's been about a year since I had you on.
It has been a while.
Good
to be back.
Do you remember what the last thing we talked about on the podcast?
A raise?
A raise?
For me? Yeah.
Didn't
you promise me a raise?
I promised.
I was going to have some more money.
Yeah.
Money. That's what you're talking about.
I need a raise before I can give you a raise. So that's the order of operations here.
We'll have to thumb wrestle for that.
So we got a lot of stuff on a lot going on in politics. Almost too much. So Kevin, what do you got for us today?
Well, a general disclaimer, because there's so much new stuff, unusual stuff happening right now. I've mostly been waiting, and I think a lot of people have been like this too, waiting to sort of figure out the best way to figure it out. You know, it's kind of like, I don't know, you throw something in the water, and you have this big splash, and you kind of wait for everything to kind of like, you know, play itself out, you know, flatten a bit before you can jump into it. And that's kind of where I've been. I think a lot of other people have been like that as well too. I mean, there's something that's we know, like the legislature's been meeting, the Texas legislature, and so that's always a little bit, I don't know if hectic's the right word, or you're just sort of like waiting for things to kind of heat up before all the bills are considered in committee and considered on the floor. Some things have been fast-tracked a little bit. We could discuss that a little bit if you'd like to.
So the Texas legislature is in session right now.
They're in session now. They meet once every other year. It's an amateur legislature, meaning this isn't their full-time job. They all have other things that they do. And not paid much, $600 a month for their regular.
$600 a month.
They don't make it an attractive position.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like you have to be able to afford it.
Yeah,
to be a legislator.
That's maybe the filter they're going for.
Like when people say, "Well, I don't think our legislators ought to be paid." Well, that means that you have people that don't need the money.
Yeah.
So, but they do get a per diem. I think it's $150 a day, but it's Austin's expensive, so you know it's not you can necessarily afford it. But yeah, they have that. I think they go until June 7th. I believe is the 140th day.
When did they start? When did they open?
They started I think the second Monday in January. I can double check real quick. I don't have it right.
Is that written somewhere in the Constitution?
It is written in the Constitution. Okay. If you go to Article 3 of the Texas Constitution, it pretty much lays out when everything is supposed to happen.
And so I kind of assume that the reason for this deliberate amateur legislature is to prevent government from doing too much. Is that in general?
Yes. In fact, that's a similar situation with the executive branch in Texas and also the judiciary. The executive branch is split into 6 different elected positions and a 7th that's called part of what's called the plural executive. So the governor is not in a position to be able to dictate what the comptroller does or what the attorney general does or what the land commissioner does or the agriculture commissioner, and who am I missing? The attorney general, lieutenant governor, the person who's in charge of the Senate, the presiding officer. Those are all independently elected. So they can do their own thing. I mean, there could be some political pull that one has over the other, but as far as institutions, they're separate. And, of course, when it comes to the judiciary, they're all elected. So that means our judges can be controlled by the electorate.
I see. All right. And so what is our amateur legislature up to now?
Well, tell you what, let me open up some stuff. If anyone is ever interested in this, you ought to be. One cool thing, living in the internet age, you can go on Texas Legislature Online, and you can see what sorts of things have been introduced. You know, so that's one thing you can do if you're interested yourself in finding out things that might be important to you. I don't think you can get me online, but we can maybe do this some other time. I do this in some of my classes where you can kind of open up the reports for a particular legislative session. Actually, you can go back to 1989, and you can look at bills by subject and see what kinds of things they're pulling up. For example, I'm doing this as we're talking. We can look at a section on education, higher education, that deals with what they still call junior colleges.
Oh, is this separate from is this about the article that you had for me?
It's separate from that, but they have junior college districts. Now, that particular, that wasn't even a piece of legislation. I sent you something. Texas Tribune is a place where I take a lot of my students.
Yeah.
And there was this one story about, I guess they're wanting the lieutenant governor anyway. Remember, he's one of the separately elected individuals.
All right. I got that one up.
Kind of jumping down the throat of higher ed.
Let's see the article you got. Texas legislature proposes $400 million cut to higher ed as Dan Patrick threatens university budgets over DEI.
Yes. Yeah.
Here we go.
The more diversity, equity, inclusion stuff. Now, what this means, though, is that this wouldn't be a bill so much as things that are removed from the Appropriations Act. Mm-hmm. Now, the Appropriations Act is what has to be passed by the legislature, signed by the governor, subject to line item vetoes by the governor, where all the money that's drawn in the next legislative session, the next biennium. Mm-hmm. Budgetary period. Because they meet every 2 years, it's a 2-year budget that they pass.
Oh, okay.
And so that would be passed by the end of this legislative session. The governor has 20 days, calendar days after that, to zero out certain things he would like to cut. And it's not unusual for governors to do that. Maybe 50 items or so. Sometimes, end up getting cut. And all of that stuff is listed public. You can follow that up. And the budget comes in place. It will be in September 1st of this year, and it will go to August 31st of 2027. So, if you figure that out, we're still in the budgeting process that was passed in the previous meeting in 2023 of the legislature. So what they're proposing is cutting. Well, if you read through this, there is something, and there's lots of detail.
Let me read and see if I can get the gist. At public events last week, Lieutenant Governor said higher ed would get less funding if they don't kick DEI out of their schools. A few weeks after lawmakers proposed a massive cut. Okay, so let's split this up into two parts. The legislature already is deciding to cut before this DEI comment.
They're threatening to cut it.
Okay.
Now, and what they're looking at is something called the Institutional Enhancement Fund, which I'm not a complete expert on, but you know what? I can become one. Ooh, especially if AI Overview is telling me a little bit. I don't think this is really. Oh, yeah. Hold on a second. An Institutional Enhancement Fund is a fund that helps an institution address its needs, I guess, beyond the regular operational budget, staffing, research, academic, whatever they want. Examples: institutional enhancement funding at the University of Texas at San Antonio is used to address staffing needs and recruit faculty. So I guess this would mean like what particular, a little bit of money that you need in order to get a good professor or something, or it'd be more attractive to folks that are going to start this program or that program or whatever. Texas is wanting to catch up with artificial intelligence, so maybe that's one of the things that you would use this for.
Okay, so now let me just come back to the article here. Days before the start of the legislative session, Texas A&M administrators were already bracing for a hit to their budget. So they were now. There's a threat to a hit to their budget, right?
That's it. That enhancement budget. So this would be, I guess, the legislature would come in and say, well, this isn't something that is part of your normal process or whatever. It's just the extra stuff. And for A&M, that was $52 million for a 2-year period. For UT, $40 million. For Texas Tech and U of H, $50 million. So $25 million for a 2-year period. And so what that would mean, I'm not specifically sure. It says here they're health science centers and technical colleges, and I have a hunch that we would fit under technical colleges. Aren't going to be subject to that, but I think that's probably because we don't get those sorts of enhancement funds anyway. So
according to this, let's see. So is this an actual cut, or is this? Well, I guess it depends what you mean by cut. So last budget cycle, according to this, there was a plan to add more money to higher education, and now they're threatening to pull back on it.
I think these would be additional cuts. Well, this is, increasingly you see the legislature, also the governor, use funding cuts as leverage. For example, I think it was, I don't know, can't remember if it was 2023 or 2021. The older you get, I have no idea.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
If it was 2 years, 4 years, 10 years, I don't know. But the governor was angry that the legislature did not pass certain things that he wanted to pass, and it might have been that year's version of school vouchers. But in order to pressure the legislature, he cut all of the funding for the Texas legislature. So just zeroed all of that stuff out. And then he calls them back in session and says, okay, well, now we need a deal. And so the legislature did deal a little bit with that. So this is just more of an example of that. Cutting things with the idea that you want to use this as a way to pressure them. In this case, and I've read elsewhere that they're not, some folks aren't quite sure what it means. They say kick DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, out of their schools. There's another thing from Inside Higher Education, where I guess in North Carolina, they're not sure exactly what that means.
Yeah.
And I guess there's also they want more proof. I think there is some legislation that's been introduced to try to, you have to demonstrate to us that you have proved this, that you've kicked this out.
Yeah. So there's a line in the article: if you don't kick DEI out of their schools, they're going to get a lot less. Lieutenant Governor said to applause, and that's always that's always a question of, what even counts as DEI? Is it just the title? Can you change somebody's title? If it's DEI officer, then you just change it and you say, okay, we're no longer doing DEI.
I'm really not sure what that means. And again, how do you prove that?
Yeah.
And who's responsible for doing that? Is there going to be some sort of audit where people are going to be hired to come through? I'm looking at the list of bills that are filed under junior college districts, and I don't see a specific thing related to DEI. Maybe I just need to kind of look at some of the other higher ed stuff, but I don't know. But there you go.
And I mean, this could still have an effect, though. I mean, if even if
on us,
well, it has an effect on universities if they're told, we want to cut back in DEI. That's going to affect their behavior. I mean,
well, that's the intention. Yeah.
Yeah, they're not just going to say, well, you can't define it, so we're just going to totally ignore you. I think that just that threat was going to get them to say, okay, they kind of know.
Yeah.
They kind of know what DEI is if they're the ones who've been promoting it. There's whatever they've been doing, they're just going to have to roll it back and try to guess, and that will have an effect. And maybe that was the intended plan.
Here, let me look. There's House Bill 3295. It says related to the repeal of certain requirements regarding diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives at public institutions of higher education. Let me open this up. Not much has happened to this. It's just been introduced. But if I open up the bill, there's not much to it. It says Section 51.3525 of Education Code is repealed. Now, then it doesn't have a link to that particular thing, so I'm not quite sure what that refers to. Let me keep looking around. Let's keep talking. But
yeah, and so towards the end of this article, they say it's a familiar playbook used by budget writers. And something happened in 2023. Lawmakers specified in the budget that public universities were set to receive an extra $700 million, but there was a catch. The money would evaporate if the legislature failed to pass 2 GOP-backed bills that weakened faculty tenure. So interesting to see what that is, and eliminated diversity, equity, and inclusion offices. So there's something that's objective that you could say, all right, anything that was labeled DEI, that could be targeted. And then they could just simply watch the staffing. Did you just move everybody into a different office?
Are you still doing it, but you're calling it something else?
Yeah. I mean, so that does give them a foot to stand on. They could say, all right, you call yourself DEI. Here's the initiatives you had. Those initiatives are not going to be allowed, right? That'll be the de facto definition of DEI. It's stuff DEI offices have done.
I think it's still kind of up in the air. I mean, I think we're still kind of struggling with some of that also here.
Yeah.
So
now, do you think this was a threat over DEI, or is there some other? Is DEI not really the reason for the cut?
I think it's part of a lot of different things. The legislature and state government in general has been trying to solidify its authority over state agencies, and that's what universities are, state universities. We're a state agency, but we're also an independent local government as well too, because we kind of collect our own property taxes and whatnot, and have a locally elected board that oversees us. I think it's part of the reason why maybe we're not as targeted, and plus we're not big fish. But Patrick, our lieutenant governor, has been pretty upfront about wanting to clamp down on higher ed in general, the same way they're doing it with K through 12. Now, one thing is, you got a lot of money that flows through that. It's the number one area of expenditure in the state of Texas.
Education in general.
Yes. Number two is health and human services. Excuse me, it's Friday. But no, I think this could also be considered a part of their efforts to try to just put limits in general. I think that we're kind of going crazy.
I'm not as familiar with the Texas university system. So when they say Texas colleges, do all public Texas universities or higher education receive some type of state funding?
That's what makes them public. Yeah.
State, and specifically state.
Yeah. Well, that's what makes them state institutions. I mean, and it's what makes us cheaper than private institutions. It's why we cost less than Rice and HBU and all the rest of those places too, because we get the state funding. Do
you have any idea off the top of your head how many universities in Texas, state Texas public universities there are?
There are 40 or 50, but
40 or 50.
You know what I can do? Because I got everything fired up right here.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask ChatGPT.
All right.
Let's see. How many public... I need to put the L in. Excuse me.
Because I'm coming from California, and I would just count up the UC system,
and
then the Cal State system, and then add the two. Those are... Yeah, there might be some other universities I don't know of, but that's pretty much it. So it's a pretty straightforward system they have.
Well, we got the A&M, the UT, U of H, and Tech. What does this say? 38. As of now, Texas has public universities that are part of the University of Texas system, the Texas A&M University system, and other public institutions, 38. UT doesn't give us a number. But the other ones, Texas State University, University of Houston, University of North Texas, and Texas Tech University. Now, those are the traditional 4 years plus your postdocs or your masters and whatnot. K through 20, I guess what we're calling it now. But there's your answer. Now, that doesn't include us. The public, the community colleges.
So this bill related to potential cuts, that's not touching community colleges.
Well, we don't know. I mean, they're not saying so right now, but it could very well be, because remember, the legislature's in session. They're dealing with the budget. And obviously they're going through this saying, well, if you don't play ball with us here, we're going to cut that, or we want you to do this, or you're going to lose that. Seems like they're using more of the stick than the carrot.
Okay.
To try to, again, this is leverage. That's basically what this is.
All right. And so they're saying it's about DEI. Maybe it is. Maybe it's more about moving more towards private. Do you think that it's an attempt to move more towards private, or move just away from expecting so many people just to go to any university of any type?
I think in general it's more about control. About the state being able to dictate more who is in charge of the different universities. And there's nothing really that unusual about this. I mean, this is sort of another flare-up. Texas goes through these times from time to time. UT ran into a lot of trouble, I think, what was in the 30s or the 40s, I think it was.
Oh, wow.
The state thought they were all a bunch of communists. So anyway, I mean, this is sort of like, it's one of the ways that politics works. The legislature, their big lever of control, source of leverage, is control over the budget, and the governor. Remember, again, one thing that makes the governor, let's say, a little bit more effective with controlling the Texas budget than the president has over the national budget. He's got the line item veto, which, again, only applies to the appropriations bill.
So the governor, Abbott, has line item veto.
All governors do, yeah.
Oh.
And in the appropriations bill. Now, when we say budget, it's basically the appropriations bill. And that is the bill that is passed, again, state level, national level. It's like, I describe it in class like the checkbook. You know, I mean, this is you got all the checks that are kind of, authorized. You fill them in with the appropriate number, and that's what the appropriations bill would do. If it's not a number, it would be a formula. Like, we don't know how much we're going to get. We can estimate it based on how many students we have, and the contact hours. All that. This is what authorizes money to be drawn. Pardon me. From the state treasury. I mean, and again, it's a process. You go out there and you buy something, you put gas in your tank or whatever, you're paying, taxes end up on a regular basis going into the treasury. And then the appropriation bill allows for the money to be drawn for, whatever purposes the legislature had passed into law. And whatever the governor had not zeroed out. Again, that's what the line item veto is. And when it's a line item, it like I said, you zero it out. It's not like the governor can say, okay, instead of $100 million here, I want it to be $50 million. It's either the number that the legislature came up with or zero. But it's also leverage. Like I said, I mean, that's one of the things that the governor did some time ago where just got rid of all the funding for the legislature as a way to get them to pass a bill he wanted to pass.
What do you think? Where do you think the governor stands on all this?
Oh, they have a pretty tight. Well, I guess that still remains to be seen. The governor and lieutenant governor for these sorts of things are pretty much on board, and I think most Republicans are too. So yeah, they're all in agreement on the DEI stuff.
And just one quick institutional question: the office of lieutenant governor, like what role, governor, lieutenant governor, and then legislature? What role is the lieutenant governor playing here?
Lieutenant governor is elected to be the presiding officer of the Texas Senate. He's not a senator, but he presides over it. He appoints people to committees. He appoints committee chairs. He figures out, what committee a particular piece of legislation happens. So, you're not, you're not the puppet. You're the marionette.
That sounds.
Is that the right? Is the marionette the person who?
The marionette, I think, is the doll.
Okay.
So
Okay. There you go. The
I don't
puppet
know,
and the marionette are the same thing.
I don't know the
puppet
name
master.
of somebody who runs if it's a marionette master. I don't know.
Yeah, the puppet master. It just coordinates the activities within.
That sounds really powerful. I always assume that most lieutenant anything is probably like figurehead, or if somebody dies, I take over. But is that unusual compared to other states? Because like this seems to be. Lieutenant governor seems to be a powerful position in Texas. How does that compare to other states?
We would have to look at the specifics in the other states, and a lot of it has to do with how you become lieutenant governor. I mean, if we want to think about it nationally, we can compare it to the vice president. Now, the vice president is also the presiding officer of the Senate, but the United States Senate, excuse me. But the United States Senate doesn't really need a presiding officer so much. I mean, the senators themselves run it. I mean, you need somebody up there, I guess, to just bang a gavel now and then. But pretty much senators do it themselves, and also the heads of the two parties, the majority leader, the minority leader, whichever party happens to be majority and minority at a particular period of time, they go through the process of figuring out who's going to be on committees and whatnot. So the vice president really doesn't have much to do. And again, a lot of it has to do with the fact that the vice president becomes vice president because the president invites that person to run on a ticket, and there you go. And a vice president also can have whatever power, let's say, a president wants to give them because they got that position because the president invited them on. Now, I gave up looking at the other 49 states because it's just Texas is tough enough to keep on track of. But if we wanted to answer that question, one thing we would ask is, how does a particular person become a lieutenant governor? And I think that's the term that's used in all states. How do you get the job? Again, you're elected independently in the state of Texas, and so that means you have an independent source of power. I don't think, I mean, as far as institutions, the governor doesn't get to tell the lieutenant governor what to do, and the lieutenant governor doesn't get tell the governor what to do as institutions, as governing institutions. Now, beyond that, in terms of their relative power within the political party, they're both Republicans. Then there's a little bit more of, maybe more behind the scenes.
Has there been anything to your knowledge of any friction at some point between the Texas governor and the lieutenant governor?
Over the course of history, there has been quite a bit, yeah. There was a period of time, too, when it was argued that the lieutenant governor was more powerful than the governor, and some people still default into that. But one of the things that Rick Perry, our previous governor, demonstrated was if you hold on to the governorship for a long period of time, the few things you get to do, you can leverage into a lot of power. Mm-hmm. So Rick Perry was governor for 14 years, and the big thing, the job of the governor primarily is your chief executive officer. And in addition to what you can do in terms of legislation, the veto power and whatnot, and it's an important power. And let's say it's a more powerful ability on the state level than the national level, because since the legislature meets so short, it's such a brief period of time, the bulk of the legislation is passed towards the end, and then as soon as the legislation is passed, the governor has, again, like I said, 20 calendar days to veto something. But a lot of times that 20 days is after the legislature is no longer meeting in regular session, and so that means there's no opportunity really to vote to override a veto. Mm-hmm. So the veto, what's called a post-adjournment veto, because it's after the adjournment, is quite powerful. Now, that's one of the things the governor has, but what I was going to get into was the governor's ability to appoint people to state agencies. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the reasons why somebody might want to support, you want to be on the winning side.
Yeah.
So, you want to be friendly with whoever is going to be governor. Give them contributions and support and things like that. Support the pieces of legislation that they want, and that means in return he'll do favors for you. And the biggest favor is appointing people to the regulatory commissions, the state agencies that oversee whatever it is that you're doing. And if you hold on to that position for a long period of time, you get to not just appoint them but reappoint them. When Texas governors were weaker, for example, before 1974, the governor had a 2-year term. And it was very unusual. I see. Meaning every 2 years you got the opportunity to get kicked out.
Yeah.
And it was very unusual for people to hold on to the job more than, let's say, a couple of terms. Mm. So it's like, 2-4 years, you're out. You would have exceptions. There was a guy in the 50s, and I can't think of his name right now, Alan Shriver, who held the job for 8 years when Eisenhower was president. And he was powerful. But Rick Perry, again, kind of demonstrated that if you hold on to the office for a period of time, you can become powerful also.
Yeah.
So though the standard story is still that the lieutenant governor is a stronger position than the governor, I don't know to what degree that's still true.
All right. So now changing topics, let's jump to how the federal government now, so there's a lot of stuff going on in the federal government, budget cuts, and now here we go, article from Cron, layoffs fuel long lines and frustrations at Texas national parks. So now, Texas is being hit by federal cuts, and now this goes up to, so now we have the, of course, situation with DOGE, and then, of course, this whole issue of can the executive actually cut spending, or is that Congress?
Well, it's not so much there's a lot to it. And to get to it, the question about whether or not the executive can't cut funding so much as try to get around it in different ways. Back in, I think it was the 60s and 70s, Richard Nixon did this thing called impoundment, where he refused to spend money. So the legislature established, because remember, what a president's supposed to do is faithfully execute the laws. What does that mean, though? There are ways, again, you can get around it, kind of like with the DEI stuff.
Yeah.
You maybe, one trick is, the people you put in charge of a particular agency don't really enforce the law that much, or at least you kind of give it some lip service. So in a sense you're executing the law, but let's say not necessarily faithfully, or at least, or let's say not maybe instead of that with vigor. You're not doing it vigorously. So you might be inclined, say a person, Obama's executive branch would have more vigorously enforced environmental law, than the Trump folks would, or the Bush folks before him. Now, getting into this, though, I mean, one of the questions too is with DOGE, what is it? It's not a governing agency.
Yeah.
So what authority do they have?
I think the only authority is Trump listens and then is willing to do whatever he can to follow whatever they recommend, essentially.
Yeah, but what authority do they have? Like if somebody wants to come in, all right, let's say somebody from, we're here at Alvin Community College, and let's say somebody from College of the Mainland wants to come in and say, Albert, you're fired. What would you do?
Oh, I would say I would have to look up at my actual chain of command and say,
where does it say that somebody from College of the Mainland can come in and fire you? Yeah, they can't, right? So that's part of the issue. I mean, and if you've been reading up on it, I mean, there apparently is this tactic. What were they calling it? Flood the zone. Do all this stuff.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like I said, you're throwing some, a big boulder in a peaceful pond, and it kind of, it's waves and everything for a while, but after a while it kind of calms down. People figuring out what's going on. So you got, these DOGE folks coming into, wherever and saying, well, you can't come in anymore. You don't have the authority to do it. It's kind of like with a lot of bluster, they've been able to get away with some of this stuff, but now folks are kind of pushing back. The courts are starting to push back. But then there's all these other sorts of questions. What happens next? That's why, I'm still waiting for things to get calm so you can kind of, figure out to some degree what's going on yourself. So if I want to talk about this sort of thing in class, because right now I'm not sure how. I'm figuring it out slowly, but we're getting into that. Now, what you were saying about the parks, though, it's just another example. I mean, it could also be, look, if we've got control over the budget, then we have control over, everything to some degree. So why they're picking on the U.S. parks or whatever, I'm not quite sure. There's some kind of, I don't know. So I was going to say there's some kind of strategy, but some people say there's not.
Let's see, big band. Let's see, the National Park Service fired 1,000 employees nationwide under sweeping cost-cutting measures. I wonder how that works. I mean, National Park Service is, I don't know if they're pressured to fire people or, how does the money dry up, right? I guess the question becomes, can the executive basically refuse to spend money? Or, there's a certain amount of money that's been allocated to parks, and then can they say, okay, we're going to, I guess they could say either we don't want to spend it or no, we want to spend it in a different way that is at least theoretically inconsistent with the law.
Well, the law is something the legislature passes. So the law says you spend money on this sort of thing here. That's why I said with impoundments that when the Supreme Court, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, ruled on a case saying that, the president has to sign this. Now, that issue is coming up again because keep in mind we have a different Supreme Court. And a Supreme Court with 3 people that, President Trump appointed previously and some other, folks that seem to be a little bit more sympathetic to the idea that the president should be strong enough to be able to do this. Now, suddenly he is bringing this case again to the courts, and the courts can change their mind on this. Existing, I don't necessarily want to say law, but at least case law or existing Supreme Court precedents say that you can't do this. A president can't do this. If the Congress says, well, look, we've decided to establish this particular agency for this particular purpose, and we're sending this amount of money to do that particular thing, this has to be done. Now the president's coming in and saying, well, you can't make me. And again, like I said, that's part of what Nixon had tried to do, and the Supreme Court was with them. But again, maybe they change. We don't know. All this stuff is people like the idea that there's some kind of permanence in the nature of law and whatnot, but you forget that, there's a lot of this conflict that plays itself out in different ways, and things change quite a bit.
Yeah, from what I know is the president, doesn't the federal government say withhold funding? There's always a question of if, say, a university doesn't respect Title IX, or I was always under the impression that all this training that we do to, for Title IX adherence and stuff like that, that's all done under the potential threat of the federal government withholding funding from us, right? So there is some leeway for the presidency or the executive branch to withhold money for some I mean, maybe reallocate it. I guess maybe that's the idea. They could say, oh yeah, here's a certain amount of money for higher education, but it doesn't have to go to you. We can send it to some other school, and we're going to decide it based on, some criteria.
If the legislature has in law that there is a punishment associated, financial punishment in this sense, in this example, that is clarified in law, then that is not a violation of the law because it's written there. Here we're just, I think the argument, some of it is just the cuts are kind of random. We're not really sure exactly what they're for.
Let's see. According to the article, the Valentine's Day firings coupled with a hiring freeze and fork in the road buyout offers have park advocates concerned. So, yeah, this doesn't really get into what really got the ball rolling in terms of these budget cuts.
Well, it's just I think the best way to approach it is that they're looking at anything within the federal government, according at least the DOGE people. Is fair game. Now you see some internal conflict, however, where you've got finally some people appointed, cleared by the Senate to be in charge of some of these areas that are kind of pushing back and saying, because I think it's the Interior Department. I believe this Parks Service is under the Interior Department, and you get a Secretary of the Interior. They oversee hiring. That's their baby. So they're saying, okay, DOGE, you can't come in here. First off, you're not a governing entity. We are. We have these powers in law. And so you can't fire people. It's like I said, somebody from College of the Mainland can't come in and look at Jefferies, you're out of here.
Yeah, but I mean, the difference is if someone from College of the Mainland, if the Board of Regents really likes this person, and if they decide to, we'll go along with whatever you say, then suddenly what that person says matters, right? Because it's all about influence. And if...
But that would be a decision made by the Board of Regents.
Yes.
Not a decision. I'm just saying if they decided they want to come in here and pull the trigger on.
So I mean, when I say DOGE wants to cut, what that really means is DOGE makes a recommendation, and it seems like Trump is 100% on board with what they're doing, what they want to do.
There you go. But again, is this the kind of thing that a president, I don't necessarily mean Trump, I mean because it applies to anybody, that you could do randomly? And that's part of the issue too. And some people are pushing back against some of this. I mean, there seems to be a lot of, if not arbitrary, at least a political purpose behind this. You want to get rid of the career civil servants that are supposed to be neutral.
Oh, that's definitely something that they've been wanting to do.
Replace them with political folks that are going to then be committed. And it's like we go back to Andrew Jackson days.
Yeah. Well, just to represent the other side. What they always say is, no, those people are the political ones. We're the good ones. We want to, no one says we're going to fire those people so we can get our political people in. The people who want the cuts are going to say, no, the bureaucracy is already filled with, DEI or political activists, and we want to replace them with people who will do a good job. And that. So you always accuse the other side of playing politics, and then always say, "Oh, my side is we're just being righteous." Right?
Yeah, but then again, we do have rules in place, administrative procedures and things like that.
Yeah.
For example, okay, the person from College of the Mainland wants to go to the board here and get rid of you or me. There's still a process.
Yeah.
In fact, the Board of Trustees can't just fire somebody. Maybe they can put the president or whatever on the hot seat. And try to persuade someone to get out. You still have rules you have to follow.
Yeah, there's the process.
When they say that everybody is, subject to the rules, no one's above the law.
Yeah.
Well, that's the consequence of it.
Yeah. So, is there lawsuits going on now? What?
There's tons of them. Yeah, tons of them. And this is where things are going to start to get interesting. Now, keep in mind. The courts operate here because, the president has a sympathetic Congress. His part, in fact, one thing you could say is one of the reasons all this stuff happens is because, Republicans won in 2024. Narrow control of the House and the Senate, but as long as you got one more than the other side, and you keep your ducks in a row, you can get done what you want to get done. they're on board with what the president wants to do. So if you want to push back, you go to the courts, and that's where when you said lawsuits and things like that. So you see tons of this. I saw, I was listening to something earlier today. There's something like 40 or 50 major lawsuits in different places. Some of these, I think some people are trying to get, class action lawsuits with all of the federal employees who are getting, fired or whatnot. So there's a lot going on here. Now, some folks are coming in at some point. I hear the big question then becomes, is since the courts, as much as we like to think that the courts are powerful, really the courts are as powerful as people will allow them to be by following what the judge says.
It's their, legitimacy. That is all they have, right?
Yeah. I'll do this in class. I'll say, well, if you want to test the power of the executive versus the courts, get in your car and go run, go 100 miles an hour up and down Highway 6. At some point, the cops are gonna.
Who has the guns? Basically,
who's got the guns? Who's got the guns and who's got the money?
Yeah.
So you just have reputation, and you have this norm. That you follow what the judge says, and that includes the executive branch. Well, what happens if that norm is violated?
It makes me wonder if that's why they're trying this buyout strategy, because it's a way of if they could simply bribe people. It's like, hey, we're not going to fire you, but here's here's a carrot if you want.
Yeah.
You get it into their mind. We may fire you, and here's a good deal you can take if you leave.
Yeah.
And then just don't replace that.
And by the way, we didn't fire you, really. You just, we gave you an offer and you decided to take it.
Yeah.
So that's what makes it legitimate.
It's, I think, in general, the United States is borrowing a lot of money. And this is a big issue. It's a big issue in economics. Really, what is it? Are we at $2 trillion per year? Is that where we're roughly at?
We can, the first, in terms of a deficit?
Yeah,
you can look them up. I think the biggest one we had, 2021, it was like 3.
Yeah.
It's
massive borrowing during Corona, and then kind of didn't really come down. Now, the problem is that, usually everyone says, if you ask people, they'll usually say, yeah, of course we should borrow less. But when it comes down to, well, gee, how are we going to, borrow less? That's either more taxes or less spending.
Yeah, nobody wants either.
And no one ever wants either. And so this DOGE thing, even if they were doing things that, you liked, the reality is I always thought that cutting government spending is ultimately going to be incredibly unpopular. And I'm still kind of assuming that at some point there's going to be cuts that even Republicans don't like, and it'll happen fast. They talk about, obviously, let's go after fraud and stuff like that, but the big meat is going to come from stuff that there are people who actually enjoy these programs. National parks, but it's going to be more than national parks. You start cutting things, even defense or anything like that, it's going to have an impact, and people are going to, even Republicans, I would imagine that even Republicans would push back against, especially with such a narrow margin. We have an opportunity to test that. Again, if you look that story that you sent, there was a mile-long waiting a line to get into Big Ben, and there never is. Have you ever been to Big Ben? Not to the actual park.
It's gorgeous, but it's empty. You don't have to get behind any lines or anything. There's still lines at Big Ben, unless you start firing people. And actually, but that story also mentioned that one of the people that was fired was, I guess, one of the emergency rescue people. Well, that's going to be great. What happens if somebody's out there somewhere and you're not able to rescue them because they got into some kind of jam?
The problem with cutting spending is that there will always be a story, whether or not it's backed up by statistics, a story of something terrible happened because of this budget cut. Some kid died because there should have been somebody there and there wasn't. Somebody died. Here's her picture. Here's her family crying. And this is because of budget cuts. And no matter how justified you think that budget cut is, you could find, in a country this big, you could find one way it blows back. So just in general, attempting, now I believe they want to cut $1 trillion per year. That is so much money.
You don't have it. We don't have $1 trillion to cut.
And I mean, I'm saying even if we did, there's just so much blowback. There's just political blowback of there's going to be stories of people who are suffering, and you can make a story about that. You can't really make a story about money you didn't spend.
Yeah.
Like that's a boring story saying, oh, we're borrowing this much less. There's no story that makes headlines.
Yeah, we could, though. This actually might be kind of interesting since we got tax day coming up. So looking at the federal budget and all of that. I mean, and again, it's something that you bring up and people sort of listen and forget and whatnot. But so much, I think something like 2/3 of our budget is mandatory. In other words, the law says this is how Social Security works.
Non-discretionary is that?
Non-discretionary, and half of discretionary, if not slightly more than half, is defense.
Yeah.
But that's, again, $800 billion, something like that.
Yeah,
but that's, we're not going to get rid of defense.
Well, and then not only that, but I hear that this interest rate service on our debt is about the size of the defense budget now because of rising interest rates. So
now this is, I think it was, we can look it up. That's not difficult to find all that data. 400 or 500 billion, something like that. Now, one thing I'd love to know, because 25 years ago, the latter end of the Clinton administration, we actually had 3 years of surplus. And the Congressional Budget Office, one of the things they do whenever every budgeting cycle is they say, okay, given where we are right now, not changing anything, and barring any unforeseen thing like a COVID or whatnot. What is going to look like in 10 years? And after that third year, after 10 years, they said our debt's going to be paid off.
Yeah.
But then you had a bunch of people coming in and saying, wait a second, there's a good reason why you want to have some degree of this. And I need to revisit some of that because, I don't know, I'm a big believer that, the man don't tell you everything. And there's all sorts of decisions that are made in the the tables, where they're eating dinner or drinking at Davos or whatever like that. And countries like to have a place where they can stash their money. And I think that, because remember, we're not borrowing money, we're offering treasury bonds.
Yeah.
And people purchase them.
All right. Well, we have to repay. They mature. We have repay. We borrow more money to repay.
Yeah. and people park their money here, and they make a pretty steady. That interest goes some places, right? It's nations, industry, whatever. A lot of it is ourselves. Because we borrow money against the Social Security makes money.
Yeah.
So we habitually borrow against the Social Security trust fund. But yeah, I mean, there's strategy associated with this. What do we do with what do people do with this extra cash? There's no bank where you're going to put trillions of dollars. But if you're holding a bunch of treasury bonds, and again, you're getting a return from it. It's almost like a lot of our funding is investment oriented.
Yeah.
And there's been so much. I don't know, how much do you know about the private equity market and all of that?
Just enough to teach undergraduates, but
I want to find out more because that's a lot of stuff in Texas over the last 30 or 40 years heading off in that direction. Private equity. So maybe we can talk about that at some point.
Oh, absolutely. This is really
so I can learn.
Let's do last second minor predictions. I mean, my minor prediction is these are mostly going to be surface level cuts. I think the Trump administration is going to have to rely on something like tariffs to actually raise money to cut the deficit. And I think that there's just going to be a limit to how much you can cut without Republicans pushing back. So I think that there's going to be some threat of pushback from Republicans. And then I think that's when DOGE takes his foot off the pedal, which is going to have to happen pretty soon, just from a purely political point of view. And then it's going to be, can we pay the debt with tariffs? What do you think's coming down the pipeline?
I am a big null hypothesis guy. A lot of times, nothing. Sound and fury signify nothing. That's pretty
good. I like it because I always assume that when somebody comes in saying, well, we're going to cut spending, it's really a question of, are we going to grow the budget at 0.5% or 2%? It's not really actually shrinking it because that is just really hard for anybody to do.
I've yet to see it happen.
All right. Thanks for joining us. We're
You're welcome.
6:35. Take care. See you again later, Kevin.
Take care.